Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. My name is Bill Benson. I have hosted the museum's First Person program since it began 22 years ago. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Allan Firestone share his personal firsthand account of the Holocaust with us. Allan, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person and to be with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Allan, you have so much to share in our short time together, so we'll start. Before you tell us what happened to you and your family during World War II and the Holocaust, tell us about your parents, Azriel and Clara Wisnitzer, and their life in Kołomyja, Poland, before the war began.
Here we have a picture of my parents. I think it's from 1916, so I assume this might be their wedding picture. My parents had two girls older than myself. My parents were fairly middle class, relatively well off. They had their own house, a substantial house, which also served as a grocery store and bar, which they operated before the war. In addition to their own house, they also had a couple of cottages, which they rented out across the street from their house. And somewhere along the line, when I was born, I was the boy together with four girls. So this was quite an exciting time for my parents. And I found out later on, after the war, from a cousin who also doubled as the family gossip, that when I was born, my father was so happy he opened a bank account for me in all of the places, town and city in England, Liverpool. Why, I have no idea. And she, of course, didn't have any idea of what bank that account was in, and obviously no account number. So I never pursued it, and I have no idea how much it was, but obviously there was some money there in order to be able to do that.
We can only hope that it's still sitting there and someday, somehow you come across it. I hope that's the case. So,
Thank you. I hope so,
Allan,
but I'm not going to hold my breath.
you're not going to hold your breath for that. Okay. Allan, as you mentioned, you had four sisters and they were considerably older than you. Tell us about them and about this picture and what the age range was.
This is a picture of my family without me in that picture. So this was obviously taken before I was born. From left to right starts with my oldest sister, Ruja or Rose. She was, by the time the war broke out, I think she was in her mid-20s. The next one to that is my youngest of all of the four sisters, Rachel. She was probably about 6 or 7 years older than I was, so she must have been a teenager. Next to her is my sister Julia. She was the one that actually survived the war, and she was, when in 1942, she was 20 years old. Mm-hmm. And next to her is the second oldest sister, Frida, and she was probably in her early 20s. I don't know exactly how old she was. And of course, standing is my mother, and next to her is my father in his very formal portrait.
Yeah. Allan, there you are, born January 31st, 1933. You've got four much older sisters, with your oldest sister being about 24 years older than you. What was it like for you as a young boy to have those older sisters?
Uh, by the way, this is me when I was approximately 4 years old. And to answer your question, it was great. I was the apple of the family's eye. My parents doted on me, and my sisters did too. And if they didn't, then all I had to do is squawk and complain, and everyone bent over backwards to make me happy. So that was a great situation for a young boy to be in. I had a great time.
I can only imagine that that was the case for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your family's life in Kołomyja at that time before the war began?
Uh, my parents were what you would call uh, progressive Jews. Although my father attended services regularly, uh, nevertheless, they sent all their daughters to school, to gymnasium. The gymnasium was language of the lecturing was in Polish, and we all spoke Polish at home. So we were, again, as I say, fairly well off and well, modern, leading a comfortable life.
Mhm. Allan, you had the opportunity before the war to start school, I believe kindergarten. What do you remember of what that was like for you?
Well, actually, I started off two schools. One was the Hebrew school, the Aleph Bet, which traditionally started when boys were 4 or 5 years old, maybe younger. If you were a little bit more orthodox, I suppose you started at 3. And the second one was the regular kindergarten. And the things that I remember about those experiences are two. In the Hebrew school, that's where I first met up with other boys of my age, and we succeeded in stealing cigarettes from my parents and were able to try our luck with that. And that was probably the most memorable experience of
At age 6, right?
yes. The other school, again, nothing um, of any significance other than the fact that my parents insisted that rather than going to school on my own, I would be taken in hand by the family maid. And the only thing I remember of those days is that I was awfully embarrassed to have somebody chaperone me.
Allan, you were just 6 years old when World War II began in September 1939. Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and your hometown, being in eastern Poland, was occupied by the Soviets. What do you know of how the Soviets treated your family at that time?
Since my parents were middle class and my parents were operating a business, that did not stay well with the Soviet authorities. So, in short order, my parents lost their livelihood because that just was not the Soviet model. Uh, my oldest sisters, the ones who were attending gymnasium, uh, had to adapt to the Soviet culture and Soviet language, or rather Russian language, I should say. So when the original language of instruction was Polish, and the course of study was Polish authors and Polish poets. Under the Soviet system, they had to start learning about Russian culture, Russian poetry, and of course, the language of instruction became Russian. So that was quite a bit of a change for them. Uh, for myself, nothing much was impacted because I was too young to really be impacted in some way.
Yes, I'm trying to imagine, Alan, what it must have been like for your sisters. Almost overnight, they're forced to essentially be taught and speak in a different language that they did not speak, Russian. And not only that, then the entire curriculum is different. Your point about different literature, different culture, that had to be just a tremendously difficult transition they were going through.
Yes, they were. And of course, my only memory of that is the constant whining and complaining by the girls, how things were changing and how much work they had to do in order to keep up.
With the Soviets forcing your parents to give up their business, how were they able to make ends meet and feed the family under the Soviet occupation?
They did some work sort of ab sub rosa. My parents had a big warehouse in back of their house. And I remember that one of the things that kept my mother occupied was raising geese, which of course eventually they had to be either sold or used for food. My father was busy with a apple orchard where he was converting the apples to some jam or of some sort, which again was something that they were selling. And presumably also there was some savings which they used to supplement whatever they could.
Mm-hmm. Alan, given the age of your sisters at that time, did any of them have their own families of their own?
At one point during the Soviet regime, my oldest sister got married, and her husband and she had a baby boy who was probably about 2.5 years old, around sometime during 1942. Is my impression.
And we'll come back to Richard. That was his name, right? We'll come back to
Yes.
Richard in a little while. Alan, in June 1941, Nazi Germany and its allies invaded the Soviet Union, and very quickly your town was occupied by the Hungarian army. That summer, the Nazis took control of your town, and circumstances for Jews truly became horrific. Tell us about the Hungarian occupation, and then what new restrictions were imposed once the Nazis were fully in control.
The Hungarian occupation was rather benign, although they did enforce a requisition all the young males, Jewish males, to work on the railroad. As you know, the railroad tracks are not the same size in Russia as they are in Western Europe. So the first objective of the occupation is to work on equalizing the railroad tracks to supply the German and Hungarian forces with supplies and whatever.
So just to enable them to be able to move into their assault on the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That lasted a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
Soon thereafter, the German authorities took over, and when I say authorities, was the civil administration and police, consisted of German and Austrian SS. Once that started, and of course, the situation deteriorated. At a minimum, all Jews were forced to wear armbands identifying them as Jewish. Then the laws started coming out thick and fast. We were all required to turn in all of our jewelry and other currency. And then the next thing was a law that required us to turn in all of our furs. When I say we, it was my parents,
Right,
my older
right.
sisters. And all that was under the pain of death for not complying with the rules. Again, because of my young age, I was not impacted directly. One of the things that the authorities did is to forbid all Jews from using the public transportation, and also they forbade them to attend entertainment, movies, and for me that was the major problem. No movies, and more importantly, after the movies, no visit to the local ice cream parlor, because those things were now off limits and forbidden.
And it was forbidden for Jews. That's
Yes.
yes. In the fall of 1941, large roundups and mass executions of Jews in Kołomyja, your town, began. Tell us what happened to your family a few months later in January 1942.
In January 1942, there was a big roundup. My parents and I lived sort of in a suburb of the city, or away from the center, I should say, rather than the suburb. And the first day of the roundup, we were not affected. However, the German authorities were quite efficient, and they had lists of all the Jewish intellectuals, the more substantial citizens of the town. And the following day, after the initial roundup, my father was visited by 3 Ukrainian auxiliaries working with the Germans, and they arrested him. And they returned. I don't know if it's the same 3 or a different group of 3, but they came back a few hours later and arrested my oldest sister and her husband. My family was the substantial citizens of town. My brother-in-law, or my sister's husband, and this is my oldest sister.
Julia, yeah.
No, Rose.
Rose, excuse me, Rose, yeah.
Yes. My Rose's husband was a university graduate. He was an agronomist. And so, being somebody who used to working with peasants and their agricultural endeavors, he was certainly suspect as a communist. And so he was a prime suspect to be arrested. And then finally, to make a long story short, the following afternoon, again, same or different group of Ukrainian auxiliaries came back and arrested my mother. So that by the end of the day, my 3 sisters, I, and my then young nephew were left in the house.
Alan, just to make that clear, so the Nazis made 3 separate trips to take your mom, your dad, your oldest sister, and her husband away separately.
Right.
Did what happened to them?
Well, this was just the beginning of the roundups, so nobody was really quite sure what was happening. My sisters got word somehow that if they were to provide enough funds to pay the right people in the local jail, my parents and my sister would be released. That went on for a few days and nothing ever happened. What we found out subsequent to that is that they could not have been released from jail because they never were in jail. Once my family was arrested, they were immediately marched off to the local forest and they were executed.
How quickly did you learn that and know that your parents had been killed
It was
and your sister?
probably a week or two, or sometime even like that. And it was we just eventually lost all hope, and word started getting around about people being marched off to the forest.
In March 1942, several months after your parents and Rose and her husband were taken by the Nazis, the remaining Jews of your town of Kołomyja were forced to move into a ghetto. You and your sisters were still with your nephew, Richard. Tell us what happened to Richard when you were forced to move into the ghetto.
Once we moved into the ghetto, things were rather beginning to get very dicey as far as food. But once we got into the ghetto, of course, things got proportionately worse. My sisters tried to take care of the little baby, but couldn't. And eventually they persuaded the paternal grandmother to take over and take care of him. After that, a few weeks later, there was another roundup, and this time the paternal grandmother was rounded up together with other Jews and marched off to the forest again to be murdered. Since my little nephew was obviously not expected to march, he was used by the SS as for target practice, and he was murdered right there on the spot.
After that, Richard, after that, Alan, you're now in the ghetto with your sisters, your 3 sisters, and for a while, Rachel, who was the youngest of your 3 sisters, took great risks, tried to bring food to the family. Tell us how she did that, and then what happened to Rachel.
I'm not sure how it happened, but she was ordered to go to the local farms to harvest whatever was handy at that time. It so happened to be sugar beets. My sister was working the fields, and at the end of the day, as the girls were marched back into the ghetto, she was smuggling these sugar beets so that my sisters, myself, and our cousins had something to eat. And if you tried to eat raw sugar beets, I can guarantee you would not like it. It wasn't very tasty. But that was what we had to survive in, and so, like it or not, that's what we ate. This went on for several weeks, but unfortunately, one day, as my sister was coming back into the ghetto, she was discovered to bringing in contraband and she was arrested, and we are not quite sure what happened to her because we never saw her again. The presumption we have is that she was one of those that was taken to the local forest and murdered there at that time.
Allan, now, of course, there you are with two remaining sisters at that
Right.
point. How did you, as such a young boy, how did you spend your time and survive in the ghetto?
Well, the prime preoccupation was to find some food somewhere or another. But absent that, I, together with other boys my age, we just spent our time wandering around, trying to keep ourselves occupied. One of the things that we were occupied with, I'm embarrassed to admit, was the highlight of our day when we would keep a lookout for the local man with his horse and wagon who would be going through the ghetto collecting the corpses of people who died of starvation the prior day. And that was our main occupation, is to keep track of how many this today as opposed to how many in the day before, and so on. That was one of our prime preoccupations.
And what a horrific thing for you to remember after all these years.
Yes.
Allan, one of your sisters in that quest for food, one of your sisters took you to a section of the ghetto, and I think there was 3 sections of the ghetto, and she took you to one to get food for you, but you only went once. Will you tell us about that?
Yes, the ghetto was actually consisted of 3 sections with gates in between the sections. One did not go across from one section to the other unless one had some urgent business, because the ghetto guards were not very nice to us, so one never knew when you would be hit, beaten up, humiliated, or even arrested. However, the section A was where some communal activities were carried on. And one of the things was an orphanage that served at least 1 meal a day to the orphans. One of my sisters, took me across from Ghetto B section to Ghetto A and convinced the people who were running the orphanage that indeed I was also an orphan and certainly was qualified to get some food, which they proceeded to give me some sort of watered down vegetable soup, but certainly was much appreciated because that was the only thing I had that day. And of course, once we had our meal, my sister took me back to the other section of the ghetto. Somewhere along the line, the word started getting out, I don't know how, that the authorities would focus on the orphanage, the orphans, for the next roundup. And so I never went back for any more soup. It was my only experience there.
Allan, Germans began rounding up the ghetto residents and deporting them to the Belzec killing center. They were liquidating the ghetto, and with this liquidation of the ghetto happening, your second oldest sister, Frida, decided to try to escape. Tell us about Frida.
This is Frida, very lovely young lady.
Mm-hmm.
It was as the summer started going into fall, it became obvious that the objective of the authorities was total liquidation of the ghetto. My sister scraped up some money and together with one of her girlfriends, decided they would try to get some false papers identifying them as Christian rather than Jewish. And they would get on a train from the town, Kołomyja, to the next biggest city, which was Lvov or Lviv in Ukrainian, and try to find some way to survive there. Unfortunately for them, the girls were recognized by somebody as being Jewish. They were denounced to the local police and arrested. And we never heard from them, although the expectation was that they were put on the next available train to the Belzec concentration camp, but we never actually heard from them.
And to this day, you still don't know what
No, we never learned
no.
what happened to them.
Allan, by late summer, early fall of 1942, it's now just you and Julia, just your only remaining sister, and you're still in the ghetto. How were Julia and you able to find a hiding place while in the ghetto to try to avoid the continuing roundups and deportations?
We found out, just word of mouth or something, that our neighbors were building a hiding place in one of their cellars and were building some sort of a false door behind which they hid. We had nothing to do, but being without any options, we sort of forced ourselves to join them. The neighbors were not very happy, but the alternative, they were feared that if we did not hide with them, we would be arrested and would possibly talk to the police about their hiding place. So that's how we survived twice during these roundups. Towards the end of the summer, things were becoming rather dire. However, my sister had a boyfriend, Pavel Vermouth, and that's a picture of her and the boyfriend. And Pavel was part of a work detail that was marched from the ghetto every day into the forest, and their job was to go through the belongings of the people who were murdered the day before and see which were suitable to be sent on to Germany. Because he was on a work detail, he was getting some rations, which he shared with my sister. He was marched into the forest one day with his detail, but at that point, instead of being put to work, he and his fellow workers were machine gunned. Before he, of course, went on his last detail, he told my sister that he arranged with his former maid, Frania Paliga, that she would hide him and her when the time came to leave the ghetto. He obviously didn't make it, but my sister crawled over the ghetto wall and went to visit Frania and convinced that even though the boyfriend was no longer alive, that Frania would hide her. That left me in the ghetto for the next 10 days or so. And
completely by yourself, utterly completely by yourself.
Yes. It was a very dark situation at that point. The ghetto was pretty well depopulated. So I never saw any of my former friends whom I could spend time with. And I basically spent my time going back, wandering around, and then going back to the apartment that we shared at one time and just resting. Before you ask me the next question, I will tell you I have no recollection at this point of how I survived, what I ate, if anything,
Right.
but I survived.
With your sister Julia now hiding with in the home of Franja, you also were able to get out of the ghetto yourself. Tell us how you ended up hiding with Julia in Franja's apartment.
Julia sent word to me through a friend of hers that she wanted me to bring to her certain clothing that she had. I bundled up what I thought was appropriate, jumped over the fence, and went to the apartment where Julia was staying. And this was the building that she happened to be staying in, and delivered my package, which she was not too happy with because I guess I was not very attuned to women's clothing. So, however, I did offer her that I would turn around and go back to the ghetto and try to bring her some more appropriate clothing. She stopped me from going back and said, "As long as you're here, wait a little while." She then talked to Franja, and I don't know how, but she convinced her that even though the boyfriend wasn't there, Franja would hide her and me in her apartment. So that's how I came to stay there.
Allan, from that photograph that we see, which is a more contemporary photograph, is it possible to point out where you were located, where Franja's apartment was?
Well, Franja's apartment was on the second floor, just below the eaves of the building.
And there, of course, you're there with your sister, and I believe Franja, am I correct, that she also had a child? So
Yeah, she had a teenage daughter, Stasha.
So the four of you are in there, and you would spend with Julia, you would spend the next year and a half hiding in her apartment. Tell us what that hiding was like and how you were able to avoid detection over a year and a half.
If you've ever read a story called The Adventures of Narnia,
And I have.
and if you have, then you know that there is a bunch of English children who climb into a wardrobe, and the wardrobe has this magic door in the back. They climb to that magic door, and they have all sorts of adventures with talking animals, etc. Unfortunately for me, I did not have this magic door, but my sister and I spent our time sitting in that wardrobe from morning till night, trying to be as unobtrusive, as quiet as possible. When visitors came, including the teenage daughter of Franja's, who had a German soldier as a boyfriend, and they would sit in the apartment, and my sister and I were sitting in the wardrobe, trying not to breathe, but survive. At the end of the day, we would climb out of the wardrobe, stretch out on the floor of the apartment, and then the following morning, we would continue with the same routine, climbing into the wardrobe, trying to be as quiet as possible to prevent anybody from discovering us.
day after day after day.
Yes.
Yeah. What did you do while hiding, while you were in that wardrobe? What did you do? Besides try to just not breathe and avoid detection.
Yes, that was the primary purpose. However, my sister was a student, gymnasium student, and so she had a lot more education than I had. So to occupy our time, she was trying to teach me some of the basics about geography, arithmetic, and just to keep us occupied and try to teach me the multiplication table, that sort of thing.
Just trying to picture probably speaking ever so softly to each other with her trying to teach you a
Right.
little bit of what she knew.
Yes.
Yeah. Alan, did you and or Julia, did you ever go outside once during that year and a half?
No, we never did, but we did get out of the wardrobe when we were given advance warning that guests would be coming to visit Frania, at which point we would climb out into the attic just below the roof eaves, and we would at least be able to stretch out at that point. But we never went outside or saw any light.
You were liberated by the Soviet Army in early 1944, just shortly after your 11th birthday. Tell us about your liberation. How did you know, and what did that mean for you?
Towards the end of March of 1944, there was the beginning of cannon fire, which we were beginning to hear. So that gave us some hope that there was a battle going on and that the Russian forces were nearby. Uh, However, without any other option, we kept continuing climbing into the wardrobe until one day Frania opened the door of the wardrobe and said, "You can come out now. There are Russian tanks on the streets of the town." And we knew at that point that we were liberated. And so we left at that point.
Once you knew that you were liberated, the Soviets were there, did you remain with Frania for any length of time?
No, we did not, because my sister had some inkling that there might be other people who were in hiding. And so her objective and mine was to link up with any other survivors that we could possibly find. As it turned out, my aunt and uncle did survive with their children. And a couple of hours after we left Frania's, he came by looking for us. And by that time, we were already linking up with other survivors, and we stayed in a house that used to be owned by some doctor in town.
Okay.
We did not stay with her because the apartment was small, very cramped, and certainly we did not want to impose any longer than we had to.
Right. At some point after liberation, at some point while you were connecting with other people who had also been in hiding, your sister got married at some point. And tell us about her new husband.
Her new husband was a bit older than she was, but he was even a friend of our families before the Holocaust. So he took it upon himself sort of to take Julia and me under his wing and took care of us.
Mm-hmm. Alan, during that at that time, the Soviets were implementing a number of border changes in Eastern Europe. Kołomyja became part of the Ukraine, you and your family, as Polish citizens, were encouraged to move across the border into another part of post-war Poland. After some time, Julia and her husband, Eddie, I believe, decided you were no longer safe there. Tell us why you and Julia and Eddie left Poland in 1946.
The Ukrainian authorities were very happy to get rid of Polish citizens and encouraged us. That's perhaps a mild word, but sure enough, we ended up going to Poland and eventually ended up in a territory that used to be German and now became Polish territory, with the city of Breslau now becoming a city of Wrocław. We lived a fairly comfortable life for about a year and a half or so from 1945. And I attended the local gymnasium, doing my best to catch up on all the studies that I missed over the years. But in the summer of 1945, in a city called Kielce, there was a pogrom because some kid went off wandering and never came back in time to his family, and everybody panicked and decided that the Jews must have killed him and done something to him. So the pogrom was a full-blown one. About 40 some odd people were killed and others injured.
And these were people who had just survived the Holocaust.
Yes. They were also living in one house, planning to emigrate to Palestine, but that didn't make any difference. They were killed. The word spread out like wildfire about what happened in Kielce, and that finally convinced my sister and her husband, who then already had a baby girl, Miriam, that life in Poland was probably not for them. And so we ended up in the American zone of occupation of Germany.
And that's where you ended up in the Zeilsheim displaced persons camp there in Germany, I think, Allan. And you were there for a few months until you and Julia, Eddie, and their baby daughter, Miriam, immigrated to the United States in February 1947. Tell us how you were able to get to the United States at the age of 14.
When Julia and Eddie first applied for visas, the local consulate in Frankfurt told them that I could not travel with them because I was not part of the immediate family. That put them in a quandary, either to leave me in the DP camp in Zeilsheim, and where with the hope that eventually I was going to find my way to Palestine, or alternatively, they prepared papers, or Eddie prepared papers showing that I was adopted by him, and since he was quite a bit older than Julia, that seemed normal at that time, and they reapplied for visas, and at that point, we all came to the United States. That's our picture, and I guess that's the visa showing the happy family, Julia, Eddie, their little girl, Miriam, and myself.
Allan, I want to dwell on that for just a moment. So you and Julia survived the war and the Holocaust. She is your only family member, but you were not able to get a visa because you were not considered part of the immediate family.
Right.
And so Julia's husband turns around and adopts you, and now he's your stepfather and he's your brother-in-law.
Right.
And because of that, you're able to get the visa and make it to the United States.
Yes, I don't know if he formally adopted me or simply stated on the papers that I was adopted.
But he declared so, and so that's what
Yes,
happened.
yes.
So you did make it to the United States. You didn't go to Palestine. You came here. Um, Tell us about your adjustment to the United States. You're a teenager now, young teenager, and after all you've been through, what was it like for you to um, start a new life in the U.S.?
Well, I guess I have to go back a little bit to my life in Wrocław, where I attended school. The children or the students that I was working with and going to school with, were about as anti-Semitic as possible. I don't know whether they were inculcated by the Germans or whether their families expressed their feelings to them. But I was the only Jew, or at least the only Jew, official Jew, in the class. And so I was harassed, fought, attacked all the time, every day possible, during recess, before classes, after classes. There was one other girl there, a bit older than myself, who always tried to defend me. And I suspect she was Jewish, but she never admitted to it. Anyhow, to get back to your question, what was it like? How should I describe it? Even now, I kind of get teared up because it was like a totally different world. The students that I went to school with embraced me with open arms. They gave me friendship. They helped me with my studies. They helped me with my English. It was a totally different world. I had no trouble adjusting to a new environment. I will never forget those kids that I worked with, that I went to school with.
That it gives me goosebumps just to hear you describe it that way, Alan. I have one more question for you. In the face of rising global anti-Semitism, please tell us why you continue to share your firsthand account of what you experienced during the Holocaust.
I do that because I realize that there are people who are now beginning to question the truth of what happened. They're the Holocaust deniers. And I want to let everybody know as much as I can, as often as I can, that indeed, yes, this did happen. And this is my story. This is what happened to me. And I don't want anybody to ever forget this.